Your source for land and boundary expertise. PYB is for homeowners, realtors, and land professionals seeking the knowledge, tools, and services to prevent and resolve property boundary issues and complete successful real estate transactions. Check us out at protectyourboundaries.ca. We've got a booth out there. I'm not going to go through the rest. Let's get on with our next presentation because I really like the sound of this one. I'd like to invite to the stage Timothy Arnott, principal of BA Group. Tim joined BA in 1990 and has since applied his urban planning and engineering background to hundreds of transportation planning and engineering projects. He focuses on two main aspects of our business: traffic and parking studies, detailed data collection and analysis. He's currently heading up an innovative new system for collecting, analyzing, and managing transportation data. Tim was an integral part of the development of the new Vaughan Mills Regional Retail Centre northwest of Toronto, and has recently completed work on Minto Midtown, a new high-density residential and mixed-use development at Yonge and Eglinton. Timothy's going to be presenting the future of GTA parking. Please welcome Timothy Arnott.
This is about the second time, I think, in 2 years I've actually worn a jacket, which is going to factor into a little bit to what I'll talk about in a bit. What I wanted to go over today was a couple of example zoning bylaws from, I'll say, more or less progressive municipalities that have, and I selected 6. 4 of them have actually gone through recent bylaw updates. So they've sort of spent some time thinking about parking and tried to translate that into revisions in their zoning codes. 2 of them have passed those bylaws, and 2 more are still debating them. Toronto and Vaughan have recently passed theirs. Markham and move this forward. I can't see anything from here. Markham and Mississauga are going through them right now, but they're still debating and they're still trying to sort of figure things out. Oakville is going through a process whereby they're trying to sort of figure out a whole mobility question, and parking obviously factors into that. Hamilton is a surprisingly progressive sort of thinking in the parking realm. They haven't had to be coaxed into a lot of the more progressive rates and parking concepts and what parking means for development. Basically because they've got a fairly progressive chief planner there, and he's sort of prone to taking a proactive approach and making sure that parking and mobility is sort of dovetailed nicely with the land use and transportation relationship. So go quickly over some examples of those parking bylaws. Then I want to talk about some of the trends that are happening or that are affecting parking basically in the GTA and elsewhere, and then come back to the same 6 and look at what they've done basically after spending in many cases 2 years trying to adjust what their parking rates are and respond in many respects to the trends that are affecting parking. So this was a lot bigger on my screen at home. I'm not sure whether you can see those or not, but basically there's 4 categories of land use that I was trying to key in on. Apartment resident, apartment visitor, office, and retail, just as examples, which are probably the 4 or at least 3 big sort of parking drivers in many of the urban areas and redevelopment mixed-use developments. Toronto's downtown rate was established about 2013 or 2011 to 2013 through some studies. It's been enshrined in their 569 2013 bylaw for all that time, and they have probably more recently, certainly within the last, say, 5 years, they've been inundated with parking reductions. So variances, bylaw, site-specific bylaws, a lot of OLT and board decisions that have reduced parking. And as part of that, that was the impetus for them to sort of revisit their bylaw and get a little bit more practical about what kind of rates they had. They started out with zones, essentially. They're one of the first to do that, identifying that there were different contexts, mobility contexts in urban areas, so that parking should respond to those things. And many other bylaws in the GTA responded to that. They started sort of picking up on it and identifying high density areas on the fringe of that, and then, for lack of a better word, rest of city. And so those rates were sort of graded from the lowest in the high density areas to the highest in the sort of rest of city. And they ranged in Toronto from about 0.7 per unit for res to a little over 1.5, I think, for the maximums. Let's see, that would help. Mississauga's has always been a little bit of a laggard. Although they have their city center and they want to call it that, and they think it's very dense and urban, and it is, they're really sort of lagging and have in terms of the parking rate and trying to recognize and drive the issue as opposed to responding to it. Hamilton has always had rates that were relatively progressive, and they were based on not only area but on the size of the units as well. And so from that perspective, they were actually taking a bit of the lead, and they have been doing that for some time. Markham's in kind of the same boat as Mississauga. They have rates that go back decades and really haven't changed them at all. And Oakville's a bit of a strange bird. They have this midtown, so they have two bylaws. One is the area in the south of Oakville and the area in the very north of Oakville, and then they have one that's in the middle. And the one that's in the middle, ironically, which is not got the best choices for mobility, it has actually no minimums for residential, which is surprising. The other zones in Oakville actually have minimums, and they're reasonably high, particularly if you're thinking about a place like Midtown of Oakville, where they have the GO station, and it's kind of the hub of all the transit activity in the town, and it connects fairly well, actually, to the balance of the community. So that's apartment. The visitor ones have they've really not changed very much. They're in that sort of 0.2 to 0.25, which is sort of that 25-year-old or older rate that is a very suburban rate. Toronto was a little more progressive. It used to be in the downtown at 0.06, which was reliant upon the fact that there was a lot of other parking around, which made it a little bit easier to sort of distribute that and spread the load, if you will. And then they sort of graded up to 0.2, which again is sort of that older standard, and it just doesn't it hasn't survived very well. It's generally provided more parking than what has been necessary. Office, Toronto again, with fairly progressive rates. They're in that sort of 0.3 per 100, which is generally lower than what the leasing and the marketing people want to see. But given the modal choices that the Toronto has, particularly in the downtown, that's usually a very supportable rate. In fact, a lot of our clients, the large office buildings downtown, are now engaged in actually reducing that further. Toronto's a very open city from that perspective, and they welcome those things. The same can't be said about certainly Mississauga, Markham. Hamilton, to a lesser degree, has been, again, fairly progressive. Vaughan was reasonable. They tended to be in that sort of 1 to 3 per 1,000, which made the leasing and the marketing guys happy, and generally contributed to a little bit more, traffic. But that was something that was a byproduct of trying to market the product itself. The last one was the retail, and Toronto's bylaws in retail fairly low in the downtown, 1 per 100, but they really, they get really high, 6 per 100, which is that kind of old shopping center, power center kind of rate. And it was driven in large part due to some applications that were received in the late 2010s, which really drove that number and made it, they threw it in there basically as cautionary. Markham, Vaughan, Mississauga, and Oakville all had the sort of traditional ranges of the retail rates, anything from about a 3 to a 6 or 5.4, I think was some of the numbers in there. Again, responding to something that was kind of very old, traditional shopping center kind of mentality. There was some acknowledgement for places in Mississauga like the city center where you could have a lot of sharing going on between uses, and so that knocked down the rate a little bit. But otherwise, it was a fairly high rate. So with that sort of a backdrop, just want to run through quickly some of the trends that have been affecting parking significantly, certainly in the GTA. The first one is policies on a provincial level, regional, and municipal level. There are documents out there, the provincial policy statement, Ontario's 5-year climate change action plan, the Planning Act, et cetera, that have policies in them. They've been there for quite some time, relatively speaking, but they really haven't been seized upon lately, until lately, to kind of drive home that point and force the hand of some municipalities to try then, get them thinking a little bit more about the trend itself and the objectives that are typically now, front and center. So they relate to environment, they relate to traffic congestion, to a whole bunch of other things. But embedded in that language, there is policy arguments now that we're using regularly to try and convince the municipalities that they really do have to conform better to this kind of provincial objective at that level, certainly from the planning perspective. The growth plan is another one that it had some specific references in there to creating an environment which is more sustainable, and from that perspective, it would be supportive of lower parking rates from that direction. The regional and municipal official plans are also a good source for that policy information. A lot of them now are just simply requiring that there be some kind of response in terms of the transportation plans, particularly for development, but also when they're doing their master plans and other mobility plans for the municipalities. And then finally, it's the zoning bylaws, within which, of course, are parking descriptors that are basically the standards that describe not only the supply, but the configuration and the placement of parking. All of those now are starting to get reviewed with a little bit more of the environmental and policy eye when it's being brought to the table. Now, the 4 that I mentioned, Toronto, Mississauga, Vaughan, and Markham. As I said, Toronto and Vaughan have recently passed theirs. And as we'll see, they've actually gone fairly urban and been pretty progressive about that. Mississauga and Markham have, certainly in my opinion, they've really lagged. They're the kind of municipality that says, show me an example in my municipality of what you want to build, and then I'll let you do it. The problem is, it's chasing your tail on that one, because there isn't any, or they're few and far between, and that there's not a good example of what it is where they want to go. And that's a bit frustrating when you're trying to make those cases. The next trend was basically the cost of vehicle ownership. And it's not a surprise, I don't think, to anyone that owning a vehicle is not an inexpensive endeavor. This is just grabbed from the CAA website, which looks at a variety of different kinds of vehicles, electric up to luxury, gas-powered vehicles. And the range in there is something in the order of about $7,500 to $15,500 a year, just simply to own the car. That includes gas, insurance, maintenance, payments, and it actually doesn't include depreciation. But that number does not include the parking side of things. So if you're in a condo, if you're downtown working, if you're using it as a commuting vehicle, you've got to add that onto it. And lo and behold, the parking for, or the cost for a parking space, certainly if you're in the residential land use and you're trying to buy one, easily in the $60,000 to $100,000+ a stall these days. And when you start, dropping that on top of the purchase price, because part of the what's referred to as transportation demand management, or TDM, when those plans are created for developments, one of the tenets of those plans is to separate or dislocate the cost of parking from the cost of a unit. And so when someone is seeing then what it is that they've got to spend to buy a parking space, it's the thinking is, of course, that it's sort of that sober thought, do I really need it? And am I going to lay out that kind of money for that particular unit? The same is true for if you're leasing parking, or if you're trying to find leased parking downtown. It's an easily $200 to $250 a month rate, and probably higher. Again, if you can find it. We, in our office at Yonge and St. Clair, I think we have one spot that we lease from the TPA, Toronto Parking Authority, and that's north of $250 a month. And the wait list is probably a couple of years long if you let it go. The other aspect, of course, for the cost is if there's an oversupply of parking, you're just simply building more than you need to build in and of itself, which adds time and other costs to a particular project, whether that be residential or retail or office. And then the last cost one is the maintenance, the long-term maintenance of that parking space or the garage, particularly if it's a structured garage, and the tax issues that run on over the life of the project itself. This is probably the biggest factor, the mobility substitutes that happened over the last 5 to 10 years. Mobility as a service, the Uber, Lyft phenomenon, which has taken taxis to a new degree, that has just basically exploded as a service that people are relying upon more so. It's a little bit more personal, obviously, tailored to you, the individual. Car share programs, which are out there, Enterprise and Zipcar are probably the two biggest, but they again have just absolutely ballooned in the GTA. They've got I've lost count now of how many different locations that Zipcar and Enterprise have scattered throughout the city of Toronto, but they're now definitely into the downtowns of Mississauga, of Vaughan. They're starting to spread out now into Markham, Oakville, Pickering, and they're being quite successful in that regard. Bike share, the City of Toronto's bike share program, I think they're up to about over 600 bike share stations in the city itself, with 6,500 bikes that are part of that program. It has made the sort of 0 to 10 kilometer trip, sort of more of that 5 kilometer sweet spot, something that's very easy to do, frankly, in places like Toronto and downtown and elsewhere. Micromobility, there's some firms now that are trying to get into the GTA market. Unfortunately, Toronto is a bit risk averse when it comes to micromobility. They have not seen the sort of risk benefit equation fall in favor of of allowing micromobility like scooters and electric bikes and things like that use parts of their rights of way. As soon as that starts to catch on, as soon as they can get over that hurdle, it is going to become quite a phenomenon. An electric bike will take you 30 kilometers an hour easy, and it's got 100 to 150K distance on it. So it's something that for very little effort gets you a long way. And you can outfit those kinds of bikes with, for carrying things as well. So it's quite easy. The last one, which has been the biggest in terms of the investment, and that is the transit and cycling investment that's been happening in the GTA in Southern Ontario. The provincial and federal governments now are kicking in with the municipal governments, and this is probably the fastest implementation period in decades for transit in the GTA. And by 2030, the network that's going to be in place is going to be an extremely impressive one, rivaling probably the best that you can find elsewhere, certainly in North America and in Europe. The connectedness of transit, both surface and above or below grade, and bikes in conjunction with that, and the surface systems are all going to be something that really compels the argument for less reliance on the private automobile. The next two are fairly quick. The environmental impacts have up till now obviously been there, and they've been kind of floated out by, I'll say, more of the green crowd, but they're really gaining traction now in terms of municipal metrics, and they're starting to try and measure the metrics of environmental impacts of the mobility options, all the modes, but in particular the private automobile, and that, of course, is directly related to the parking. As I mentioned before, the TDM plans that get done, the single biggest positive effect that you can have to reduce the amount of vehicular traffic, obviously, is to reduce the parking. And that's something that municipalities like the City of Toronto, Mississauga is starting to get that to catch on. Oakville, surprisingly, is now quite a bit, certainly staff are in favor of this kind of a trend, and they're trying to convince their political masters. And it buys very nicely into the whole transportation land use argument. The last is the changing mobility patterns, and this goes back to my comment at the very beginning about this is the second time I think I've worn a jacket in 2 years because I haven't had to. I've worked from home. I've been to my office twice in 2 years, and although my dining room table is a mess, I've survived. And we're 80 to 100 people in our office. One day we were there, the next day we couldn't be. And all of a sudden, our IT guy, he lost a little bit of hair in that transition, but he, stepped up, and it became a boon to trying to make it work, so to speak. But what we've learned over the 2 years is that you can't turn that clock back. The genie's out of the bottle, and everybody has figured that out. And I've always heard that if you do something for 30 days, it becomes a habit. So that applies to a lot of things, smoking and other bad habits that everybody's had. But if you do something for 30 days and you extend that into 2 years, this is a habit now we've got to get out of in reverse. In other words, you got to go, you got to convince yourself to go back to the office. And I know that for us, out of about 100 people, we got 26 who've never been to our office. They were hired in the last 2 years. This is their world. They work from home. So to try to tell them they have to be in the office is, a little bit, it's obviously there's other factors that are going to go into that direction, and we'll get them there. But you can't tell somebody you can't work from home anymore. And so, the amount of parking that you need at destinations, particularly in the downtown or at other locations, is really starting to get questioned now. And whether or not that office density comes back, or whether you need the space, you might need it, but you need it on sort of alternating days. Those are things that are going to be factored into in this equation. So, having said all that, we'll just quickly go through the same tables or the same municipalities, but their current rates. And you'll see that Toronto took the plunge and said, We have no minimums now, basically across the city. So if you're building a residential building from a zoning bylaw perspective, there is no minimum parking. They're still saying, of course, from a practical perspective, please tell us how much parking is required. So that still, keeps us busy. But it's turning the whole parking argument on its head. The same is true now for the non-residential uses in the City of Toronto. What used to be the minimums are now the maximums. And so they're really trying to play this sort of balance game between modal choices and all the other benefits and impacts that accrue from reducing parking. The same can't be said for all the other municipalities. Vaughan, I think, is probably the next one that has done the most aggressive change. They've basically more than halved their parking rates in the VMC, in the Vaughan Metropolitan Centre, for residential and for many of the non-residential uses. And then they've sort of graded that out from the VMC, where the rates are now probably half of what they were in terms of the minimum requirements. And they're open to a discussion. In fact, when they passed the bylaw in November, it took them 2 years to go through that process. There were 3 changes to the rates in that process because they just kept getting inundated with more and more applications and applications that were being approved at rates that were lower than what they were actually trying to get into the bylaw. They were chasing their tail. Mississauga is going through that process right now. Unfortunately, certainly in our opinion, they're not being aggressive enough. And from their political masters' opinions, they're getting hammered because they have the mindset of the council is still an old one. And the same is true in Markham. If you go to a public meeting, you'll see probably half the council saying we can't reduce parking because of the impact, et cetera, et cetera. And the argument back is we're not trying to reduce the parking of anybody who's got something already with parking in it. We're talking about the new stuff. And we're trying to augment that new stuff with conditions and an environment that supports reduced parking rates. Oakville, surprisingly, staff are very energetic about reducing rates, which is fabulous. They're trying to convince their political masters, hopefully that they'll get on board with that. Hamilton is already, as I said, it already has sort of a progressive nature in them. What was the other one that I missed one? If I could see it, that would be even better. But generally speaking, what's happened with all these trends and what's happened, there's a great deal of pressure that has come upon many of the municipalities. Some have responded quite aggressively and quite progressively, and others are just going to take their time. So with that, I'm going to end because I think I'm a couple minutes over.